Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is Yasu. I'm professor from University of Tokyo, and I just retired from my Asian Development Bank about 10 days ago. And so today, this session, we will have a session titled Improvement Silver Dividend. We will have 4 presentations and divided into 2 groups. First presentation, 2 presentation, and then open discussion, 15 minutes for the first 2 papers, followed by another 2 papers, again followed by 15 minutes discussion. So each presentation will take 15 minutes, 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes discussion. So this is a format. For the participant audience who have questions or comments, please put in a chat box so that we can have a Q&A after 2 presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to invite first presenter, Professor Sang-Hyuk Lee from University of Hawaii. So please upload your slide, and the title is Health Capacity to Work at Older Ages, Evidence from Republic of Korea and People's Republic of China. So Sang-Hyuk, 15 minutes, 5 minutes, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yasu, for a nice introduction. So, so this is a title, and this is co-authored with Chalkon Park. He's actually, he went back to Korea. He's a director of the Ministry of Finance right now. So the question is, how much more can older people work given their health status, which is called the health capacity to work, and how does that contribute to the economy? So which is also called a silver dividend. So there are 2 related papers, very close related papers. The first one is written by Ogawa Sensei, Noma Manser, myself, and others. Second paper is written by Rike Machikura, and again, Naohiro Ogawa, and myself, and Satoshi Shimizu. So Satoshi Shimizu Sensei is actually here, and Naohiro Ogawa Sensei is also here. So I'm very glad to see my co-authors here. So the motivation of and the contribution of this paper is very closely related with our keynote day 1, Axel Borchers, right? So he talked about this international social security project, and there are very, growing literature for Western countries. So this is, they already estimate this health capacity work, not the silver dividend, but health capacity work for 12 countries. And all of them are Western countries except for Japan. So Japan is the only Asian countries, but there is no other countries or other developing countries. So that's one motivation. And another motivation is, Axel Borchers mentioned that the labor force participation of elderly has been declining until mid-1990s, but it's increasing after mid-1990s. So he talked about this might be related to the implicit tax. So that means a pension, right? So the pension, so people are living longer, but not working longer because in developed countries, there is a very generous pension benefit. So I thought, we thought that, it would be interesting. So how can you explain for the other developing countries where there is no little room for pension reform? And then also, some poorer people in developing economies are working to their health limit. So that's actually motivation. The paper is straightforward. So if you look at this one, you can actually clearly see between 1990 and 2020, for high-income countries, the labor force participation of men actually increased. But if you look at the other economies, like upper middle and lower middle or low-income countries, actually, labor force participation of older men has declined. So this is actually very interesting feature, and then there is no evidence why it didn't happen, why this kind of a thing happened in low-income countries, why it only happened in high-income countries. Then the hypothesis is that because of a generous pension benefit in high-income countries, and because of generous pension benefit, they were able to implement pension reform, but not the other countries. But actually, there is no direct evidence for low-income countries. And for women, it's also, then we can see the rising labor force participation for women in higher, so high income and upper middle income countries, but we don't see in developing countries or low income countries. So it's actually very striking. If you see this one, it's not just to age 60 to 64. 65 is more striking, it's more actually vivid. So the question is why it's not rising. So that's another motivation. So we actually do it just to replicate the Coyle, Milligan, and Weiss, David Weiss's this global project on 12 countries to Korea and China, PRC. And actually India, we already had India, we're using LASI, but it's, we are not going to present the result here. So we use Closa and Charles, and we focus on males. And then the second question, so we actually estimate health capacity to work here, and we use national transfer accounts by age to measure the health capacity at the national level. So we estimate economic support ratio and estimate the so-called silver dividend for ROK and PRC. And also, we compare this result with the US and Japan. So we compare 4 countries in terms of a silver dividend and show the result and drive some implication. So how can we do that? We estimate health capacity for subgroups. So in Coyle, Milligan, Weiss project, they couldn't do this subgroups like pension eligible versus pension ineligible groups. Why? Because everybody in developed countries, in these 12 countries, most of them receive pension benefit, but not in China, not in Korea. So, and also in China, we actually divided by rural versus urban. So this, I think this may be actually contribution of this paper. So it couldn't be done for IS project groups. So they are very interesting cases. Very rapid population aging in large part due to low fertility. And you know that actually Korea has a TFR, total fertility rate of 0.84 last year, which is the lowest ever in history actually. And cost of children is very high because of like education cost, and they have low fertility, so there is a trade-off between quality and quantity. And the labor force participation of older people are very, very high. I will show you the graph. And very high relative poverty rate of older people. Relative poverty rate is defined as like, poverty for below 40% of their national median income. So that's called relative poverty rate. So this actually is a good measure for the inequality of the older people or younger people. And family transfers for elderly is deteriorating, and public transfers are rising, but still very low compared with the other developed countries. So this is one graph, how fast their actually aging is. It shows how long it takes or it took to move from aging to aging society and from aging to super aging society. Like in France, it took 17 years to move from aging to aging society. But in Korea and China, it takes less than 30 years. So Korea has the fastest kind of progress toward the aging, and amazingly Vietnam too. So it's not just Japan is obviously the oldest country in the world, but other countries in Asia are aging very fast as well. So it takes only, in Korea, it takes only 8 years from moving from aged to super aged society. It's so fast, actually. And second one is, if you look at the labor force participation of people of elderly, of OECD and BRICS, so all the data is for 2020, so this is the data source, but China is still, they haven't updated, so it's like 2010. So it's very well known, Korea has the highest labor force participation of elderly in the world, and China too, very high compared with any other countries actually. So why they have to work? I mean, there are reasons, and as I already mentioned, it's probably they don't have enough pension benefit. So actually, this is Iceland, and Iceland is the highest until 2019, but now 2020 is reversed. So Korea has the highest labor force participation rate of older men. This is men, sorry. So this shows the poverty rate of total population versus the elderly population, and the horizontal line is total population, and the vertical line is the population poverty rate of population 65 and older. And again, this is very well known for Korean people because Korea has the highest poverty rate of elderly, followed by China. So China has, has the highest record of poverty rate of all population plus population 65 and older. So what does that mean? They have a very high poverty rate. So some people probably can live better than other people, but a lot of people are under the poverty line. And also because of that, the elderly should work a lot. So we estimate the health capacity actually based on this phenomenon. And also the pension disparity is huge. The future gross replacement rate for full career workers is 37%. I think this is a net gross actually. But in reality, much lower because not everybody actually have this full career in Korea. And also in China, there is a huge disparity in terms of coverage, compliance, and the amount between urban and rural, and also within urban and within rural. If you are interested, please look at the paper because the paper has very detailed information. So we estimate health capacity to work by low, no, and high pensioners. Actually, low is below the median among those who receive pension, and high means above the median. And no is interesting because a lot of people don't receive a pension benefit. Even in urban area, in China, only 50%. In Korea, actually very low too. But this no pension does not necessarily mean poor people. The reason is in both countries, there is a pillar zero. Zero means actually, if you are so poor, you receive pension, basic pension, which is so low amount. So actually what happens is that those who receive very low pension is maybe the poorest people. So if you are self-employed and you are not that poor, you are actually no pensioners. So that's why we distinguish low, low, and high pensioners, and their wealth based on this category confirms that actually it is the low pensioners who are the poorest.
Sangyop, you have 3 minutes left.
Oh, sorry. Okay, okay. I will finish in 3 minutes. Okay, so we actually have this methodology, and we estimate the relationship between health and propensity of work for age 57 and 61, and similar to baseline result to a slightly older group. And that's the health capacity, and we use NTA profiles so you can distinguish the labor force participation and also productivity. And then we calculate the silver dividend. So we use this data set I already mentioned. So these are the results. So this is actual, and this is predicted. So the difference of actual and predicted is health capacity. So you can still have capacity here, Korea and China. But if you look at it by pension level, so these are low pensioners. They don't have any health capacity in Korea. The high pensioners, they have a lot of health capacity. And interestingly, the no pensioners have a high capacity, but flat. China as well, very similar. No low pensioners do not have any health capacity. That means they work until to their health limit. But the high pensioners have a high capacity. That means they retire because of their high pension. This is also very interesting because in rural China, there is no differences because the pension itself is quite low. But this is better than low pensioners in urban area. So that's another finding. So if we actually did it for other results like by education level and others, and we convert it to NTA measure to calculate the silver dividend. So this is final result. Korea and China is so low, which is much smaller than US or Japan. So the reason is in just working longer may have a limited effect in countries to support the elderly. Why? Because the productivity of older people are very low in Korea and China compared with US or Japan. So conclusion. Older people with limited pension have much less room for health capacity to work compared with the wealthier counterparts, and poor urban Chinese are actually worse than rural. And health capacity work and silver dividend can vary due to many sources, including pension benefits. And it provides answers for different trends of this labor force participation rate of elderly of high-income countries versus others. So if we actually do it for other countries, probably we can have this international social security season 2 for other countries. So final slide, policy implication. The results shed the light on policy implication for developing Asia, also population. So overall policies should consider local labor market characteristics like the result here, like based on pension eligibility. And raising pension eligibility age has a limited effect on labor force participation rate and the elderly income. So just talking about labor force participation is misleading because there, as you see, the silver dividend is quite low in Korea and China. So other approach is like retraining of older workers. So what they need is probably better job rather than just keeping this 40% of a high labor force participation rate. And also in China, reducing the disparity of pension benefits between urban and rural areas is a priority. And we need to build more data for developing Asia or to have this kind of research. Sorry, I'm actually over a little bit over time.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. You are right on time. Thank you very much for very clear and succinct presentation. So discussant for Sangyop's presentation is Dr. Naohiro Ogawa, visiting fellow of ADB Institute. So Ogawa Sensei, you have 5 minutes for your discussion, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, very clear, very clear.
Okay.
We can see you, we can hear you. Thank you. Yes, we can see your presentation slide. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, my first reaction to this paper is that it's a very interesting paper. And this paper has shed a new light on the possibilities of expanding the scope of silver dividend in developing Asia and elsewhere. And in fact, my feeling is that this paper might have one of the key classics in 20 years from now, because many people will be working on the silver dividend issues in developing Asia in the next 20, 30 years. So I think everybody will probably refer to this paper as a home base for their future analysis. But oops. And the Park Lee paper actually based on a few previous works, and one of them is Calton and his associates paper published in 2013 using American data, and they found that the huge untapped work capacity of old workers and then the potential contribution to the economy is so huge that a big boost to the GDP growth of the United States. But Park Lee paper came up with a completely different conclusion. In fact, unlike the other industrial countries, only part of the elderly receives the old age pensions in both Republic of Korea and People's Republic of China. And in other words, these two countries are not really, don't have the universally covered pension system. So they actually split the elderly persons into the few subgroups like no pension group and low pension group and high pension group. And the People's Republic of China, I think they divided further of the urban rural. And in fact, I think they divided by the group by the educational attainment. The conclusion, the computer results under the computer results suggest that compared with the industrial countries, these two Asian countries seems to have a much smaller economic gains from the healthy capacity to work. And another finding the shows that Asian cases is very different from the kind of findings that Calder and his associates came up with for the United States. And that Professor Lee and his counterpart, the co-author, made a recommendation for retraining of elder persons to improve their productivity, because in Asia, particularly China and Republic of Korea, the pension system is not really premature yet. I mean, still premature, and the per capita benefits is low, and that's why they have to work. But their productivity is low, so the author is trying to encourage these workers to have a better human capital to improve their productivity. But the elderly person tend to have a declining pattern in terms of the cognitive functioning. Even though you give them training, the effectiveness of training is rather questionable or uncertain. For instance, sometimes yes, successful case like a case with Germany, study done by Skrabek and Godot shows that because of the production structure change between the 1986 to 2006, particularly those who are in the 50s, their particular cohort improved in terms of the cognitive function, particularly fluid intelligence, which is very, very unusual, not the crystallized intelligence. And another case is the Australian case based on the Hilda longitudinal survey. And in this case, they didn't do anything. The Australian women, information processing ability improved. So I think there are many ways to improve or decline. I mean, the intelligence level. So this the training old workers seems to be has a lot much room to be desired. And then another point is that on the first day of this conference, Axel Bosch-Spahn mentioned that in Europe, the Social Security programs have been changing quite a bit, and in consequence, that affected the labor force participation rate among elder persons since 1995. I think the Park Lee paper paid a look at these two countries only in a short-run context, but I think these the Republic of China and the Republic of Korea will go through the dramatic change in the pension system in the years to come, and also these changes will probably affect the labor force participation. So I think Professor Lee and his co-author will keep on looking at the further development of these two countries so that they might detect the interesting changes in the years to come, just like the European countries. My last point is that, yes, I haven't really tried this yet, but I think that when we did the analysis for Japan, we didn't regroup the elderly persons. Maybe in Japan, we have a universal coverage pension scheme, but within the pension scheme, pension program, pension system, we have two groups: the employees pension group and then basic pension groups. I mean, the benefits levels are very different. I wonder if there's differences between these two groups in terms of the potential contribution to the silver dividend. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ogawa. For a reply and also for a question.
Professor Sawada?
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. So there is a question in the chat box and also a reply to Professor Ogawa. Let's do that after second presentation. We have 50 minutes for open discussion. So now let's move on to the second presentation by Professor John Pigott. Professor Pigott is from University of New South Wales, UNSW, Scientia Professor of Economics and Director, CEPAR, UNSW Sydney. Professor Pigott will make a presentation titled Demographics, Labor Force and Older People in Indonesia. So Professor Pigott, you have 15 minutes, 15 minutes, followed by 5 minutes discussion. So floor is yours, Professor Pigott.
Thank you very much, Professor Sawada. So let me begin by saying that I very much appreciate the opportunity to present this paper to you today. It concerns, in the first instance, Indonesia, but in fact, it's part of a much broader project, which looks at retirement income support in emerging Asia, and in particular seeks, over time, we haven't done this yet, seeks to embed that kind of analysis within a complex macroeconomic model, an overlapping generations model. So the way I'm going to do this is to start with a little bit of background as to why I think this issue, or why we think this issue. And I should say that this work is joint with a number of people. It's part of a big project. The two people who are co-authors here are George Kudner and Trung Lee, who is a PhD student at UNSW. George is a senior research fellow with CPAR, but there are others involved as well. There are people in Indonesia involved, Bappenas, the World Bank is involved, there are a number of individuals involved in the project overall. So it's quite a major undertaking. I'll start with some background and try to explain why I think this is very important as an issue. Talk a little bit about the modeling, but not in any detail. And then how important the data is, right, in informing the modeling. And then I'll talk a little about what the data tells us, not embedded in the model. I'm not presenting model results, but rather talking just a little about what we've learned from the data so far. So the background, we think retirement income support, not just in Indonesia, but in emerging economies in Asia generally, Thailand, Vietnam, others, is imperative because you have a combination of economic and social forces and circumstances which make this a very critical policy to develop sustainably and well. The first, and this has been alluded to in a number of papers through the conference, is the rapid population aging that is occurring within the Asian region, dramatically lower fertility, dramatically longer lifespans. Secondly is the rural-urban migration, which is, I guess, compromising the very close intergenerational familial ties, which we are used to observing. Thirdly, you have very high informal labor force and persistent labor force. So in the Indonesian case, it's about 80% of the total labor forces in the informal sector. And finally, the social protection structures that do exist tend to be quite immature and their coverage is quite low. And you put these things together and you think, well, actually something has to change in order to avoid major social upheaval in the future. So let me talk a little bit about the modeling. So the modeling is what we call an overlapping generations model. It will be familiar to some of you. It's a state-of-the-art model for long-term projections and long-term analysis. So when we're looking at things like population aging, this is the model that many economists turn to. But it's a model which has been built for the developed world. So the whole of the model looks at sectors which are in the formal sector, right? So it's all formal. What we're seeking to do is to integrate formal and informal so that we can see how they interrelate, and so that the modeling framework that is developed and that is calibrated using the data that we refer to becomes complete for policy analysts. We think that Indonesia is an important case study. One reason is that there's almost no social pension. So people who are in the informal sector and don't have pension contributions and pension benefits accruing, right, don't really get much of a pension at all. And secondly, it's got very good data. Not only does it have macroeconomic data and demographic data, which we of course need, it also has the Indonesian family Life Survey, which is an extraordinary survey. There's a whole group of surveys, and once again, people in the conference will be familiar with them. The Health and Retirement Survey sort of family. And this particular example covers the whole life course, the whole of the economic cycle. So it's not focused just on people aged 50 and over. It starts at the age of 20. And it has other properties which are desirable. It's sort of nationally representative, 83%, I think the number is. It's longitudinal. It's been going since 1993, so it's got a quite long history. It covers the multiple domains of finance and education and work and health, family circumstance, and of course, it's publicly available. So we use this combination of data sets, and we're working with those data sets to shape them so that they can be used in a model equivalent form in calibrating and developing an overlapping generations model, which integrates the formal and the informal sectors in the first instance in Indonesia. So the data used in the project, first of all, the UN population prospects. I've mentioned the IFLS, and then there are national surveys, a labor force survey and a socioeconomic survey, and we use those as well. To give you just a little bit more detail about the IFLS, I've given you those first two pieces of information already. Starts in 1993, so far 5 waves, and 83% of the population is representative. 30,000 individuals, it's a large data set, and it's very rich in socioeconomic variables and in the coverage of public programs. And so what does the data itself tell us? Well, if we start with demographic context, what's very striking, I think, about emerging Asia is that the dependency ratio is climbing even in countries which are very poor. And that distinguishes it really from, for example, the continent of Africa, where poor countries are not going through this kind of demographic transition yet. But there is Japan, and we think of Japan as the oldest country in the world. But you see China and Indonesia and the Philippines are there with dependency ratios which are studiously climbing. And that's coming from, of course, 2 forces. One is the decline in fertility, which is the lower left-hand panel of this slide. And you can see there, people talk about China, but look at Indonesia. It's not all that different from China. And then life expectancy. It used to be the case that life expectancy increases in emerging countries all came from mortality declines in the first part of life. But that's not so true anymore. Here we have life expectancy at age 50, and you can see that life expectancy gradually climbing, kind of taking policymakers by surprise, just as that climb in mature age life expectancy increases took policymakers by surprise in developed countries over the past 30 years. And then we have the concept of the demographic dividend, which is the top right-hand panel. And you can see that Indonesia is kind of at the max of the demographic dividend now, right? The share of the working population is probably at the max, and it's going to decline into the future. So that's the demographic context. If we turn to the IFLS now, what we find, how have things changed? Now, sometimes we use just males, sometimes we use both males and females, sometimes we separate out 2000 and 2014, sometimes we use 2007 to 2014, and this is around data availability, really, the choices that we have made there. But if we look at living arrangements, you can see that there's a gradual decline in the number of co-residing children. And what we'd really like to get at here, I guess, is the number of co-residing, not the number of co-residing children, but the number of older people who have anyone from the next generation, from the younger generation, living with them. And that's what we're kind of trying to get at. It's a bit difficult to get at with the current data. And then the percent marriage, you can see that too, not that different through time, a little bit lower in 2014 than 2000 for men, but almost the same. You wouldn't call that all that different. And then we go to employment, and employment hasn't changed that much either. There are changes that you observe. The male employment rate, you can see it's there. We've mapped it from 50 to 75. And it's fallen a little bit in the latter years of that age bracket for males. But on the other hand, male average hours worked has gone down as well. But if you look at the females, you'll see that there's some increase in female employment rate, and that's probably come from a decline in caring responsibilities. And then when you look at the average hours worked, they go down a lot. So there's a kind of trade-off on the female side, not so much on the male side. So that's employment. But once again, you would not call this a dramatic change, I don't think, in these percentages. So there's a kind of stagnation. And that comes through as well in what I think of as actually the most important aspect of these data, which are sectoral transitions between the formal and the informal sector. So this is only males now. And so you can say, well, if we take that top panel initially, those working in the informal sector in 2007 and aged in the first half of their 40s were by 2014, 76% of them were still in the informal sector. Some were not working. Only a very few had migrated in that 7 years to the formal sector. Right? And that's even more true when you turn to people aged 50 to 54. And if you flip that and say, well, those working in the formal sector in 2007 and aged 40 to 44, 70%, 69% of those stayed in the formal sector, right? And for 50 to 54, you've got a 58% number. That's a very small percentage there, but nevertheless, 58% stayed. And quite a few moved in that latter group, that older group, into the informal sector. But once again, you're not observing very dramatic formalization. The rate of informality in the labor force in Indonesia has barely changed over this 7-year period. And finally, I hope it's finally, there we go. Finally, we have income sources at older ages. And this is very important because what we're on about in this big project is retirement incomes. And what we find is that labor income is incredibly important, and actually labor income is as important in 2014 as it was in the year 2000. So for these people in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s, by and large, labor income is where their income comes from, at least until their 70s. Once they reach their 70s, transfers from children, remittances, become more important. What's very observable here is that asset income is nearly nothing, and other sources of income, and by that we infer, right, that is pension income, that's very small as well. So very little social support, very little social protection available in the income space in this period. So to summarize, we have countries with very rapid population aging, very large informal sectors, very underdeveloped social security systems. They seem to us to be very important in terms of policy concern. Something else that I should perhaps mention in passing, and it occurred to me when I was looking at the paper I needed to discuss, but something else that's happening here is there's very rapid technological dissemination, and therefore there might be a degree of labor force displacement as a result of that. So that's another piece of the storm that these different social forces are bringing to bear in these countries. We think data, the sort of data that is available in Indonesia, is really important in guiding policy, but we believe that has to be embedded within a useful analytical tool for policy analysis, and that should be available to policymakers. So just as it's available in developed countries, available in the Congressional Budget Office or the UK economy, UK Treasury or the Australian Treasury, it should be available to Bapanas as well. We need to understand more than just the demographics and more than just the macroeconomics. We also need to understand things like living arrangements and employment patterns, how they relate to education, how they relate to health status. And in those respects, data sources such as the IFLS are extremely important. And where can we go with this? Well, once we've got the model calibrated, we find that you can introduce changes to the environment. What would Indonesia look like if formalization increased to 30% or 35%? What would happen if you had a substantial social pension that took older Indonesians who have always worked in the informal sector out of poverty? Poverty is very high in the informal sector at older ages in Indonesia. What would happen if you changed the pension access age? And how do all these kinds of changes, all of which might be important in developing a sustainable retirement income policy, how do they interact with the overall economy? What are the good sorts of changes that you can make that increase sustainability? What are the changes that you might make which might inhibit or thwart increased sustainability and growth? So that's where we're going over the next 2 or 3 years, and we hope to keep many of you posted on these developments. But for now, I'm going to stop. Here are some useful references which will be there with this on the website. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Pigot, for reaffirming the importance of profiling emerging Asia's aging, which is different from OECD or developed countries' experience, and particularly Indonesia, rapid aging, large informal sectors, and also social security system yet to develop. I think really look into mechanism and policy implication. I think that's really important. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now hand it over to discussant.
I stop sharing now?
Yes. Uli Absor Mu, lecturer from School of Social Work, Universitas Islam Negari Senang Kirijaya, Yogyakarta, Indonesia. So, Mr. Mu, you have 5 minutes. So, please start your discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Yayusuke. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor John Pigot for your comprehensive and very rich presentation. It is my great honor and become my privilege to provide comment on your very insightful paper. As discussion, I'm going to raise 2 points. The first is the keywords from the paper, and the second is a series of questions for further discussion among us during and after this conference. Firstly, I would like to highlight 2 important messages and keywords that has been nicely highlighted by Professor John Pigot, including informal work and building social protection system. I agree with the author's argument that understanding living arrangement, employment patterns, and income source is an important start for building social protection system. I will start from the major themes of the author's analysis, that is many older people continue to work in informal employment not covered by social protection policy. So the paper has comprehensively elaborated the most important source of income for the people is labor income. What I would like to complement is investigating further on the employment situations of older people. So based on 2020 National Labor Survey data, 51% of older people are still working in 2020. So figure 1 here describes the proportion of older people who are working increased steadily from 47.4% in 2016 to 50% in 2030. Among the other people who are working, more than 80% of them are working in informal sectors. What implies on informal sectors here? Informality often means exclusions from social protection, as informal economy often hazardous, unregulated, non-waged, outside of state regulation and control, high exposure to hazard and risk associated to employment. So based on the 2020 national level for survey data, around 75% of older persons are at higher risk of economic disadvantage due to the type of work they are doing, such as self-employed and unpaid working in family business. So the two pictures here might reflect the exposure to hazard associated with employment. So the first picture describes the monotone ergonomic, such as sitting with long hours, and the second picture shows the practice of lifting and carrying heavy load that might influence the older people's health. So in addition to exposure to hazard associated to employment, many older people also work in excessive working hours. Just over a quarter of older person working between 35 to 48 hours a week, and around 20% working more than 49 hours a week. More than 1/3 of the older people have low monthly income and have decreased in income than the younger age cohort during the pandemic. So as a result, older people has the highest tendency to be poor on the age cohort in Indonesia. So the second keyword that I would like to reflect is building a service system. So the author clearly recommend the importance of building the system of social protection for older people to mitigate the impact of demographic shift, poverty, and at the moment is also COVID-19. I would like to further stress that social security schemes for the people in Indonesia often contributory, and informal workers often cannot afford it. So based on these situations, alternative system and financing solution, in my opinion, is needed. Another part of building system is keeping older people in good and decent employment, particularly in informal sectors, is also needed. So the demographic shift in Indonesia also provide very large market in the future that need to be prepared by the concise regulatory framework. So therefore, there is a need to build a system, including financial system, to address the needs of the current older people and the future of the people as well. And my second point is a series of questions for broader discussion among us during and after this conference. This is a little bit broad question. The first one is how to finance sustainable social protection for older people, because in Indonesia, it is always the common challenge that the policymaker often force is we don't have enough budget, we have limited funding to run services for the older people. So is there any existing good example from developing countries in extending social protection for informal workers? What state can do for the current older people and the future of the people? So at the moment it's the young people. So what the state can do for the older people, the current older people, and the future of the people? What kind of concise regulatory framework on providing social services, both provided by the government and non-government institution, could be developed? This is a series of questions that can be discussed during this conference and outside the conference, after the conference. Thank you very much. That's my 5-minute comments. I over to you, Professor Yasuki. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mu. And so now we can have we are a little lagging behind, but I think we can take several minutes to discuss. First, I'd like to invite Sang-Hyuk Lee to make some response to Professor Ogawa's comments and questions. And also there are, I think, 2 questions in chat box. So, so Sang-Hyuk, please The floor is yours.
So let me answer actually the question on the chat box first, right? To Aiko and Mohammed Abdul Malek. So it's they are asking whether we can further divide the data, and also why we didn't do it for women. Two reasons. One is the number of observation. We did it by education, but for Korea it's 6,000, for rural China 4,000, and urban China we have 3,000 observation. But remember, this is by age, so you have a lot of noise. So if we further break by skill level, just we can do that. But we did it for education, and the results are consistent. And for women, that's actually very impressive, because we in the beginning we thought we wanted to actually send a clear message, but when we did it for women, especially the pension when we divide by pension level, it didn't work much. So there are not many actually women who receive pension benefit. So the overall paper actually have like 11 figures, but each figure has only 10 figures. So there it's so messy. So that's the reason. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it for women, but just wanted to send actually very clear message using the paper. And for the Ogawa-sensei's comments, this is just excellent comment. I didn't show any result, but all these symptoms, cognitive skill, or the impairment actually has very different results, depending on country and depending on your subgroup of population, like ADL, IDL, this like daily living, measurable disability or measurable performing tasks are significant in all groups, but like their symptom and cognitive the impairment has a very different results. So what I'm saying is the message is that retraining. It's helpful to increase productivity, but also improve the quality of living. And there is also indirect effect of retraining, which is reduce the actually healthcare cost. So, I didn't put all the implication there, but Ogawa Sensei's comments are just relevant. Thank you so much. That's all that I can say.
Thank you very much, Sang-Hyuk, for a really succinct, focused response. So now I'd like to invite Professor Pigot. Also, there is one question in the chat box. So informal to formal transition, I think how to incorporate low skill informal into formal one. So further kind of addressing heterogeneity. So Professor Pigot, can you make a response to the discussion as well as chat box question?
I would like to thank Dr. Absel for his insightful comments, and we'll take them on board. I think he and I agree that the focus on the informal sector and its stubborn high level and the reliance of older people on labor income are very critical and salutary statistics which come out of any analysis of the Indonesian data. In terms of policies for formalization, I think there are two things. One is that if formalization has been so stubborn that it's barely moved in 20 years, you have to ask what kinds of policies really might move that, and should we have other policies which direct social protection toward that sector, right, irrespective of their employment history. So even if their employment history has been entirely in the informal sector, perhaps they should nevertheless get a substantial or a poverty alleviation pension in older age. That can be a more generous pension than you might offer at younger ages in terms of, say, a welfare payment, because once people get old, the incentives they have to not work and take a payment instead have been reduced. Their earnings capacity has been exhausted. So I think that's one issue, that we need to address this in two parts, that we do have a very high informal sector. These people are getting older. The traditional family ties are, it's strong to say breaking down because remittances are very strong, but certainly contiguity of children and parents is less than it was, and lower fertility means that there are less children. And so you do have, I think, an issue here which requires some social protection. And I think someone said, well, that's very difficult to deliver. But I think actually technology today is such that it's deliverable. You can actually identify these people digitally, and you can transfer using phones or electronic banking. And that's much more widely available in countries like Indonesia than I had believed before I began work on this project. It seems to be quite widespread. So the second part of that is, well, how do you formalize? And I think that is truly the $64 question, because if you succeed in getting a much more substantial proportion of the population into the formal sector, productivity would increase a lot. The formal sector is a much more productive sector. So one possible response is that you need more entrepreneurs. You need people who understand, who are trained in business, who understand, for example, what's involved in developing a debt, having capital access to capital and access to debt, and what that entails and how you do that properly. That kind of knowledge, right, is probably more valuable than educating your workforce. So it might be a very similar workforce, but you might deploy that workforce far more productively because you have much more much better capital equipment, because you've been able to establish a financial regime that allows you to purchase it. That's one possible way. Of course, education is another. And education is, everyone thinks education is important. So that's a second possibility. But education has been increasing in Indonesia, and yet the informal sector stays stubbornly at around 80%. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Pigot, for really clear response. Because we are running out of time, I'd like to close our first half of this session. Thank you very much, Professor Ogawa, Professor Pigot, and also Mr. Mu Abso for really good discussion. So let me move on to the third presentation of this session by Mr. Gretchen Donghauer. Sorry, she is an academic specialist, Center for Economics and Demography of Aging, based at UC Berkeley. And presentation title is Mapping the Unpaid Care Economy in the Asia Pacific region. So so Gretchen, you have a 50 minutes, 5 minutes, followed by 5 minutes discussion. So floor is yours. Please start your presentation.
Okay. All right. Does everything look right?
You may want to make it full screen.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yes.
Okay. So this presentation comes out of work related to the National Transfer Accounts Project that is about understanding the age dimension of economic activity, and also the Counting Women's Work Project, which is about adding the gender perspective into that NTA approach, both by separating the market economy flows by gender and also adding unpaid care work into that framework. Unpaid care work being an important part of the economy, creates the human capital of the future, sustains market labor, but is often left out of economic accounting and modeling exercises. So the motivation for this particular work is the question of, is aging Asia Pacific facing a care crisis? Will it face a care crisis? And how do we evaluate that? So the answer presented here is to begin to understand this question by mapping the care economy by demographers' favorite characteristics, age and sex. Now, there are different dynamics for paid care and unpaid care work by age and sex. The work here is focusing just on unpaid care work, but we have other work that's looking at paid care work as well and integrating the two sides for a holistic look at the care economy. So we have many ideas, preconceived notions about unpaid care work and aging populations. Generally, that aging populations will require much more care. The older the population gets, the more care required, et cetera. But what are the facts? And that's the goal of this sort of mapping project. So to define the terms here, what do I mean when I say unpaid care work? So that's mainly two types of activities: direct care for persons and the community. So this is childcare, elder care, volunteering, etc. And then a big group of activities we call indirect care. So this is sort of housework and household maintenance and management, cooking, cleaning, etc. While this is not directly caring for another person, it does by creating a housework or a household and sustaining the well-being of household members is caring for them indirectly. And we study unpaid care work using time use surveys. Unpaid care work is usually not included in our main labor force surveys, not considered as labor, although recent changes in international labor organizations, sort of definitions of work, are working to change this. So we measure unpaid care work using time use surveys, looking at how much time a respondent spend doing various activities. Those activities are coded in a way that allows you to compare across respondents and across countries if they're using similar survey instruments. And that's how we observe how much unpaid care work people are producing. We also have consumption estimates of unpaid care work. I'll talk about those in a moment. So just to start off, what you're looking at is the amount of time spent per week on average by age of two different types of work in 7 countries in the Asia Pacific region. So the dashed lines show how much time is spent in market work, and the solid lines in unpaid care work. And so generally we see that the very youngest people, well, first of all, they're in most countries not included in those time use surveys, but they're doing very little work during peak working ages. That effort increases, and then with older ages, it goes down. So what this slide demonstrates is how much time of total work effort is spent in unpaid care work. So we have countries like Bangladesh in the upper left, which the amount of time spent in market work and unpaid care work is almost the same. And then countries where there's a much bigger gap. And the time use surveys that are contributing this data are generally from the more recent surveys available in the country. Time use surveys are definitely not done at the frequency of most other major surveys. But the exception here is India. I'm sorry, it's 1999, very old. Luckily, we now have new time use data from India, so this is sort of a placeholder here for when we'll be able to update that. But so this is old India, and we'll see how much things have changed. However, female labor force participation certainly hasn't gone up, so at least some of the gender aspects probably haven't changed as much as we might think. So there's certainly a gender aspect of this. Women specialize in unpaid care work. So what you're seeing here is the difference, female minus male, in hours per week in those two types of work that I showed in the previous slide, and then also their sum. So in green is solid green line is unpaid care work, and those are in every country here above the 0 line, indicating that women are doing more of this work than men. And then the dashed lines for market work are in every country below the 0 line, indicating that men are doing more of this work than women. And then the sum, the black line, in most of the countries is, well, in all of the countries is pretty close to zero, indicating that there's similar amounts of total work being done, but there is a small difference. And in most countries, except for Bangladesh at older ages, women are doing slightly more total work than men. So getting more towards the implications of this work for aging, we see in this picture that unpaid care work produced and consumed by different ages and sex groups. So, gender isn't in this particular slide, just the age. So the blue lines show the similar production lines that were in the previous slide, but then the green line adds the consumption aspect to it. And then the purple is the difference. So that's net time transfers. And with the green line, what we see is that in every single country, the greatest consumers of unpaid care work time are the youngest children. So the lines are highest at those youngest ages. Now, how do we get these consumption estimates? So we don't observe people consuming unpaid care work time or consuming time transfers directly. We impute them based on the amount of unpaid care work activities we see produced in a household with a time use survey, and then the household roster, who lives in that household and who is likely consuming that time. So for the indirect care, the general housework, we assume that care is consumed equally by all members of the household. So if someone is producing an hour of, say, cleaning in a household with 4 total persons, then each person is consuming 15 minutes of that time. So for the direct care activities, we use regression methods that regress different household structure indicators on the total amount of time produced in different types. So whether someone is producing care for children, care for elders, and then what is the age and sex distribution in the household of persons who could possibly be receiving that care. And so what we see then are net transfers being made in the peak working ages. But another thing that's very salient here about aging populations is that older persons continue, in most of these countries, continue to make net transfers, so that purple dashed line is below zero, up until the very oldest age groups, indicating that many older persons on average are making net transfers to other age groups. And so here is that net transfer line split out for men and women. So that net transfer line, the blue dashes show net time transfers for men. The red dashed lines show net time transfers for women. Now we see that in every single country except a brief period of the age structure in Vietnam is men are receiving net time transfers. And then in red, women are making net time transfers. Now, if I had the, say, transfers of market resources, we would see the opposite, that on average, men are making transfers to women. So this is not to imply that someone's freeloading, but certainly in the unpaid care work market, at least, women, and you can also see older women are also doing a lot of this work, are making net time transfers, unpaid care work to others. So how to think about the future of unpaid care work in aging populations. So we use our unpaid care work snapshot age profiles, all those pictures I just showed you, and then combine them with UN population projections. So just take the age profiles, weight them by population counts, and then take the ratio of the production over the consumption to create an unpaid care work support ratio. So many of you will be familiar with support ratios in market estimates that will show units of consumption or units of production of market goods and services relative to the consumption. And here it's similar, just with unpaid care work. So this unpaid care work support ratio is an indicator of how population change will impact the unpaid care economy. If it's rising, it's easier to supply that care over time. If it's falling, future population change will make it harder to supply that same level of per capita care over time. So caveats with this approach, this is an indicator only. In reality, the unpaid care work support ratio is always going to have to adjust to 1. That market will always have to clear. Unpaid care work is immediately transferred from a producer to a consumer. There's no saving or net transfers over borders that would allow that ratio in reality to be something other than 1. So letting it change is just an indicator of aging's effect, not a prediction of how things are actually going to go. Also, this ratio doesn't imply that the current unpaid care work supply and demand are optimal. It is just indicating whether it's going to be harder or easier in the future to keep things as they are now. Certainly in many places, there is unmet care demand already, or rather overtaxed providers who are facing issues of time poverty. But just to show you what those pictures look like, here are 6 different panels of unpaid care work support ratio. So in the upper left-hand corner there, A is for unpaid care work is the summary measure of all of the forms of unpaid care work I've been discussing. And they look like over time, so this is using population projections from 2020 to 2070, that they're fairly stable. That even in the context where these 7 countries we know are projected to age, some of them quite rapidly over the next 50 years, those ratios are still pretty stable. Well, how can that be? So moving over to look at different subparts of the unpaid care work economy, it helps us answer the question. So for looking at just the housework, that indirect care work, those ratios are fairly flat. The age structure is not going to make it harder to supply the amount of housework that we project an aging population might demand. Then moving over to the care side, we actually see that the care support ratio goes up over time. So why is that? Now in the next row, we have the 3 pieces of that care, unpaid care work group of activities: child care, adult care, and then community care. So in aging populations, they were going to have relatively fewer children compared to the producers of care. And we saw that children are the largest unpaid care work consumers. So in contrast with what you might worry about, that older populations are going to consume a ton of care, it's actually the youngest in society who are consuming the most care. So an aging population makes that same level of care easier to supply. Now, whether the actual demand, per capita demand for care might shift in the future, that's another matter, but at least to keep things on a per capita basis as they are, aging populations make that easier. Now, of course, we see in the adult and elder care that combines both care for adults and elderly, that those support ratios go down, it's going to be harder to supply that level of care. And then finally, in the volunteering, there's not much patterning. Some goes up, some goes down, but the magnitude of the difference by 2070 is quite small. So just to go back to the sort of first impressions, unpaid care work is a large part of total work effort. It's done mostly by women, certainly more than by women than men, and it's consumed at the greatest level by children. So what are the impacts for this of population aging? Less childcare consumption, but more elder care consumption, but children are the largest unpaid care work consumers. So overall, the overall care economy is not too stressed by population aging. Now, this also sort of assumes that care for children and care for elders is kind of fungible. And that may not be the case, but it does show at least that the possible negative impacts, the excess demand for care that so many of us are worried about, could be ameliorated by trying to move some of the demand for elder care either to other persons in the population, paid care options, or supporting the elder care providers who are in those roles today. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing this really innovative use of NTA to address important unpaid care work and support ratio broadly related to gender. Really intrigued by these charts and slides. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to invite discussant Meredith Weiss from ADB, Senior Social Development Specialist. Meredith, are you?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Ready?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so,
Thank
yes.
you. 5 minutes. Yeah, please.
Yes, and thank you so much, Gretchen, for that fascinating presentation. Just a couple of comments, and this is coming from a social developments perspective. I think one of the real takeaways I got from your presentation was that it clearly highlighted the contribution that older people continue to make throughout their lives, but really highlighted the role of older women as net providers of care to children, community members, and older persons. And I think this is so salient because, you know, older women are probably one of the most overlooked segments of society. And even discussions on the care economy and gender, often they're absent from those discussions. So this kind of time use survey, which really highlights and quantifies that, is so valuable. The second point, and you just mentioned it in your conclusions about the fungibility between childcare and adult and elderly care. Like obviously they are very different, and I just wonder, in terms of the projections and in terms of some of the recommendations coming from that, you know, how to balance the key differences between childcare and adult and elderly care. Obviously, childcare is very time bound. It's clearly articulated. You know what the projection is likely to be, but elder care is obviously very, very different in that. And obviously, with that comes, you know, many multiple studies have highlighted the negative physical and mental health implications of adult or elderly care as well. So I just wonder in terms of how that can be sort of pulled out in the studies and in the recommendations as well. You highlighted in the conclusions, yes, the importance of formal care services. As we know, those are absolutely key in reducing and promoting the well-being of not only the older person, but the carers as well. And I think the evidence really highlights the importance of social networks for carers being a key factor in well-being of carers, whether it's for childcare or elderly care as well. So perhaps that's a further recommendation. And I think the sort of a key sort of question it left me with, and really highlighting and sort of echoing back on some of the presentations that have been made in this session as well, given the risks of sort of that care burden to health and poverty of carers, the real importance of social protection for carers, whether they're of working age or in older age, the need for them to be access health, income. It really highlights that if we're sort of, there is an assumption that carers can continue to provide care, that there really does need to be very, very strong social protection systems to support them to do that. So that's really just some comments thinking through some of the implications of your presentation. ADB has a number of pieces of work providing technical assistance to the development of community-based care services in a number of countries across the Asia and the Pacific. And these really, they also include a focus on how to strengthen support to informal caregivers. So I really think, you know, further work on this sort of analysis and use of time use surveys such as this would provide us with such rich evidence to really be able to design effective community-based systems and informal caregiver support systems as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So before I get into a further Q&A, let's invite the final presenter and then discussion. After that, we can have a response. So again, participants, please put your questions, comment in chat box. So final presentation is by Aiko Kikawa, economist at ADB, and also Raymond Gaspar, a consultant from ADB. So they're going to share a presentation. Title is Trends and Characteristics of Labor Force Participation Among Older Persons in Developing Asia and Their Retirement Decisions, Literature Review of Cross-Country Assessment. So I think first Raymond will start presentation. Raymond, floor is yours. 15 minutes again, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Sawada. Good afternoon, everyone. We are glad to present our study, Trends and Characteristics of Labor Force Participation Among Older Persons in Developing Asia and Their Retirement Decisions. This paper is still a work in progress, thus comments and suggestions are highly welcome as we prepare the final version. In this paper, we review relevant literature, understanding the several factors at the individual, household, and policy level that pose a strong influence on the pattern of labor force participation, as well as the retirement decisions among older persons, especially from the OECD countries. We then conduct a detailed analysis of descriptive statistics drawn from the labor force survey microdata of select countries in developing Asia, with the end goal of understanding how the identified factors play out within the context and circumstances of the region. Finally, we aim that this paper would stir public and private actions and shape future research agenda in promoting longer working lives in Asia. Over the years, majority of older persons in many developing Asian countries remain active in the labor market. The labor force participation rates of persons in the early 60s remain high and steady at around 60%. Countries, however, display some differing patterns in recent years. From figure 1A, we see a steady trend, upward trend helping Sri Lanka in red line to catch up with peers. A moderately declining trend can be observed in Bangladesh, Philippines, and Thailand. Meanwhile, more than 60% of persons in their 60s stay in the labor market in Indonesia and Vietnam, with the former country showing a continued rise following a downward trend in the early 2000s. Note that many of these working elders are in informal and vulnerable sectors or self-employed in rural areas, often not eligible for an adequate pension, leaving them with limited options to retire. Meanwhile, figures 1B and 1C reveal large gender heterogeneity of the overall pattern. First, the labor force participation rates among older women are substantially lower than that of men, particularly in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, largely attributed to gender norms. Second, there were a slight decline in labor force participation rates among older men in some countries, while that of older women experienced an uptick. Overall, the stagnant labor force participation rates among older persons in developing Asia is a contrast to OECD, that one in gray line, which have shown sharp increases during the past few decades after reaching the lowest level in mid-1990s. In our review of extensive empirical research conducted to fully understand the dynamics of labor force participation of seniors in advanced countries, we consistently identify 5 major forces that have shaped the work and retirement incentives and decisions of older persons. These are social security and pension reforms, education, health, household structure, and firm technology adoption. In many OECD countries, the decline in labor force participation of older men until the mid-1990s has been strongly linked to the rise in financial disincentives for continued work due to the introduction and expansion of coverage and benefits of public pension programs. Mid-1990s onwards, changes introduced in the structure of the pension system the most common of which was the increase in pension age, have led to longer working lives. As evident in Figure 2, incentives for older-aged adults to work become stronger since the 1990s. Documenting the series of pension reforms in 12 Asian economies, Barsh, Supan, and Coyle observed that the implicit tax on working longer slid downward during that time. Meanwhile, labor market exit in developing Asian countries covered in this study does not seem so apparent even as the individuals approach the statutory retirement age. In Figure 3, we can observe that the steep drop in the labor force participation rate following the retirement age is more obvious in Thailand, which compared to the Philippines has a relatively higher coverage of mandatory pension schemes. Based on an OECD report, 35.9% of Thailand's total labor force is covered by mandatory pension schemes, while it is only 27.3% in the Philippines. The limited changes seen in the labor force participation during retirement age can also be attributed to the pension income being quite small as a share of income, and is only applicable to a few groups of workers, especially the public employees and formal workers in large corporations. Let's zoom in other discussions and findings of the study from Aiko.
Thank you, Raymond. Then let's go to the second discussion on the second determinants of health status and longevity. So our review suggests that the improved health status, cognitive functions, and which leads to more timeline of extension of life years are critical determinants of labor supply and retirement decision. But with an important caveat that they may have mixed and opposing effects. So on one hand, country-specific or regional evidence suggests, such as one from Bundel or Coyle, that the better health conditions isn't essential to stay in the labor market. Also, longevity could encourage a delayed retirement. But as pointed out by Kalemi Ozan or with Well and other work, which approach this issue from more of a life cycle approach, the certainty of retirement years, which means that you have more probability to live and enjoy that a strip of the time after your retirement, really encourages you to save and increase your likelihood to opt to enjoy scheduled retirement. So it would have a mixed effect. So bringing this to the literature on developing Asia context, we have encountered a large literature which is confirming that health status has positive association with the labor force participation. And the flip side of that is that poor health would deter participation. So if you look at the figure 4, which shows that the share of those who report health as a reason for not taking part in the labor force, you will see that quite a high percentage. And interestingly, for countries such as Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, the share of those claiming that is increasing. And opposite is the case for Bangladesh and Vietnam. And whether the longevity leads to longer working life seem to remain as an empirical question in Asia, because indeed the extension of life years or even the healthy life years shown in the blue line of the figure 5 is increasing, and it's not just within the Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, but also other countries. But if you look at the how it's unfolding by the age group, you would see that most of the improvement in the life expectancy occurs among under 5 population. So the toddlers, infants indicated in orange line, and you really do not see much improvement of the older population. And indeed, we see adult mortality and morbidity is on rise with an increasing incidence of non-communicable disease. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are then moving to the education? What are the schooling influence on labor force participation? The recent evidence from OECD shows indeed that the improvement in the years of schooling is seen contributing to higher labor participation, and that highly educated group, as you see on the figure 4 in the gray line, they have seen greater participation and also later retirement in the phased manner. In Asia, if you look at the case of some of the Asian countries, you see a somewhat different pattern. So while the educated group in the gray line, does exhibit higher participation among prime age group, their participation drops dramatically at old age. And that the trend seemed to be pronounced over time. And older and educated workers may have more incentive to lead the market access with the pension and saving, as was discussed in the earlier paper by Dr. Pigot, and that this seems to be really the case. But also, if you look at more from the demand side, there seems to be a lack of career path and also employment for older and educated workers in the region. Next, please. Let me also quickly run through 2 other key determinants, which are household structure and duties and the technological change. So reduction in the burden of a household work, including informal care, does help increase participation increasingly among women. And that was even also not just evidence among the older primary age group, but among older women, because once they have a track record of working, continuation would be much easier than re-entering without any experiences. But if you see that across the developing Asia countries, as you see in the figure 8, the household duties do remain as a major and the major reason for women, even older women, not participating in the workforce. And I think earlier presentation shows why, and that the amount of care work that they're contributing to household, which matches very much this picture. So there would be a lot of, the participation would have much continuously large barriers due to these obligations. And lastly, there's an unprecedented pace of adoption of technology at the workplace, which could threaten the current and the future job security of older workers. And technological change, which alters the skill content or demand for labor, could influence labor and retirement decision among older persons. And their job skills and knowledge may become, easily become more obsolete at the fast pace. That said, there are elements that technology can help older workers remain and be productive, so that we should not be just looking at it as something that is a doom for older person. And also in developing Asia, older workers are occupying more routine and manual jobs, and that, as you see in the figure 9 or 10, they're mainly in agriculture and elementary occupations, and also which are yet seeing a large phase of automation. So this is not something that is imminent, but maybe an issue to be discussed in the coming decades. Next, please. So to conclude this literature review paper, which is matched with some descriptive microdata, here are some of the observations and also some of the policy tentative policy implication that could be drawn. So we saw from the first slide, labor force participation of older person in development Asia remains relatively high compared to the countries at the advanced stage of aging. So if there are opportunity to incentivize the continuation of work for those who wish to do so, there are a large space to work. We have identified some of the key drivers of labor force participation trend, and that which are at the driving seat in OECD countries, which might have equally important impact in developing Asia or the implication, but some other, they would also seem to be exerting other divergent impact because of the different context and the different institutional network, as well as all the other endowment that is different across. And here are some of the areas of policy consideration giving for each element of determinant that we have looked at. So pension and social security so far seem to have limited influence on labor force participation, except for some of those who have access to it, which are a very low number. But it also shows from the example of the skilled or educated group of workers that future pension reform should consider its implication when it's going to have a greater, and it's evidently is going to have a greater contributions and greater payout. The implication to work and retirement has to be taken into account. In terms of education and skill, as I said, highly educated older workers are exiting labor market at early stage, and that this there might be some need to address the barriers, and that particularly in Asia, this seniority-based HR practice is pervasive. So that might be one of the reasons why older person once out have very difficulty in going back to work. So maybe those need some revisiting over time. And health status of the older person has remained to be a very important determinant, but some of the evidence showed that their health status have not really improved, with some reporting some degree of a deterioration. So that has to be addressed if labor force should remain at the high level as it is now. And again, household work remains to be a major barriers, and that the more effort has to be made if the encouragement is for them to consider participating in labor force. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raymond and Aiko. So discussant for the presentation is Professor John Pigott. So Professor Pigott, 5 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Sawada. I need to be able to share my screen there.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you. I'll just stay, I think, with this slide. I did have a, maybe I can go to the earlier slides. So the main points of the paper, I thought it was a very interesting paper. I enjoyed reading it. Main points I think that were made, I may be doing some injustice to Aiko and Remy, but I think the main points, it's kind of like a comparison of developing Asia and the OECD. And they pointed out that over the last period, some decades, mature labor force participation had been growing in Europe, but was stagnant in Asia. The health status links between labor force participation and health were very strong in Asia, but the social security links seemed to be weaker. That education led to earlier retirement in Asia, which was, I think they were implying the opposite from that in the OECD. That informal care, as a reason for non-participation, is declining in importance in Asia, but is still quite important. And finally, of course, the role of technology dissemination and obsolescence, and how that might impact on employment opportunities to the older population. So maybe can people see that screen? Should I?
Yes, we can see that screen.
Yeah. That might be better. So I do think it's a very important topic, a vital product. And it sort of came out in that earlier slide that I showed in my presentation, because you get this huge demographic dividend and this burgeoning mature labor force, right? So the population, the proportion of the overall population that is in mature age, but still active, right, is getting larger and larger, because you've had this decline in fertility and you don't yet have, right, major advances in longevity. And so that means that this is a huge potential resource which you really need to try to access. When we look at stagnant labor force participation in Asia versus the increase in the labor force participation in the OECD, I think it is important to realize that what happened in the 70s and 80s in the OECD was remarkable, right? Pension access ages were reduced over that period, and they were reduced because there was a mistaken perception amongst many countries that by encouraging older people to leave the labor force earlier, you would create new opportunities for younger workers. And these younger workers, right, were facing very high unemployment rates at that point. This was in the aftermath of the oil crisis of 1973, and there was a period of 10, 15 years when we had stagflation through these economies. And so that led to a very low retirement age in these countries. And what you've been observing in the 80s and 90s and 2000s is a recovery from that. So if you take the Australian example, which I happen to know about, we still haven't got back to where we were in 1970, right? So there's a big U shape in mature labor force participation. I think what I found a little bit frustrating in reading the paper was that many of the countries in Asia, which the authors dove into, have very high informal labor force. And that distinction between formal and informal wasn't very much made. And obviously this has a big impact. So if you take Social Security, decent Social Security applies to 20% of the labor force. Not that surprising in a way that overall impact of Social Security is less, because in Europe it'd be 80%, right? As well as that, there will be differential relationships, I think, in education and health as a result of that informal labor force. I think there are some policy implications out of this work, and many probably policy implications. And I think, as I said at the beginning, I think it's extremely important and a wonderful start to delving into what the contours of mature labor force in Asia might be. Two that strike me are lifelong learning and the importance of social pensions in these countries. Lifelong learning is really as a response to the point about technology. And social pensions, because if you have these very high informal labor force ratios, then you need to provide for people's retirement. I know there's a perception that working longer is good for you and you're healthy if you work for longer, but actually, and you've got more secure income if you work for longer, and that's better for you, and that's true. But if you abstract from the income security aspect and just look at health and retirement, then the relationship is much less clear. And while everyone in this conference would like to work longer, I'm sure, right? That's not true for most of humanity. Most of humanity find working at later ages a huge challenge, and they do it because they have to, and that's not good necessarily for your health. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Very interesting paper. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss it.
Thank you very much, Professor Pigot. So now I'd like to hand over microphone to Greg Cheng. I think you may want to respond to that discussion as well as questions in chat.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments. I think that that the strength of our estimates is if we can turn them into a more technical tool that can be used to evaluate the scale of the need for care. So certainly in trying to figure out how to shift more elder care to paid care providers so that we can reduce undue burdens on family caregivers. There's an opportunity there to use our estimates to show that the scale of investment needed is manageable, that it's not enormous. It's not the kind of like long-term care issue, that medicalized care that can be so expensive in so many countries and seem just insurmountable. So hopefully we can use our estimates to help sort of build what I have heard in the newspapers in the last couple of weeks is a more care, less carbon economy. And then there was a question in the chat about how we get consumption estimates for the consumption of care from time use surveys where there's only one respondent. So in one time use respondent per household. So in that case, we get with a population representative production schedule, but then we get the consumption schedule for how much consumption you get from only one care provider in a household. And so then we can look at the aggregate levels of both of those and net the consumption aggregate up to match the production schedule. All right, and then I'll hand my time over to others.
Thank you very much. Your clear response. So now, Raymond and Aiko, I'd like to ask to respond.
Sure, thank you, Yasu. So thank you, Dr. John Pigot, for your thoughtful comments. When we were looking at your presentation on the movement from informal to formal, your diagram, we thought, that's what we were missing. We have, time series labor force data, but we were not quite too sure how we can look at this informality and that how we can demonstrate the informality and how whether there has been a significant change of that among older persons. So maybe following your recommendation, we would be looking at that using some cohort and see movement from formal to informal for certain age group across all these countries, and that might give a little bit more insight on older workers' employment and working status and their possibility or likelihood of accessing any kind of social welfare. And point well taken on the policy side. We haven't worked very extensively on that, and that maybe the way we deal with it is as you said, how we can leverage experience in the mature workforce rather than just focusing on the how many would participate and that drive them to participate. So maybe we would revisit our policy section part to reflect on that in more depth. Thank you very much. And Raymond, if you have any other comments. Okay, then yeah, okay for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Aiko. Thank you very much for everyone. So this session was titled Improvement and Silver Dividend, but I think a few points I'd like to highlight. Number one, I think presentation, especially first and second presentation, reaffirmed the importance of HRS or broader HRS type of panel data set and innovative use. Charles and Kloster first paper and second paper, IFRS, maybe I may say a broader HRS family data, but we need to incorporate a new cutting and third paper NTA and shedding a light on a very important critical area, very innovative and clever use of data and framework. And then finally, the last paper, doing a stock taking, we can figure out what's the peculiar nature or missing elements in the existing studies from OECD or developed countries, especially informality of the economy is a key issue. So I think we had a very good combination of presentation discussion. So please join me to thank our presenters and discussants. Thank you very much. And then we will move back to the main room, so we can just exit from this room. Thank you very much, everyone.